What's up, YouTube? Blaze here, and I'm back with another reaction video. Okay, this one's gonna be a little different because it's from one of my favorite all-time content creators. The man, the myth, the legend, Count Dankula. Now, as for the video we're gonna be covering today, we're gonna be covering the Battle of Athens. And before you go and ask, it's actually the Battle of Athens, Tennessee. As for what it's about, well, Count Dankula is not the only one that covered this. There's also the Fat Technician. But the reason why I wanted to cover Count Dankula's version, it's because of how he adds a little extra humor to the content. So, here we go! If you guys are ready, I know I am. Let's go!
If there is one recurring theme that keeps popping up in the Mad Lads that we talk about, it's desperation and the lengths that people will go to if they are pushed hard enough. Whether it be Don Alejo protecting his land, Gary Plauché getting justice for his son, or either of the two killdozers doing a bit of landscaping for their tormentors. Another theme is the Mad Lad is often fighting back against an authority, and when you combine both of these themes, well, things can get a little bit crazy. Today's video is about a group of Mad Lads, a group whose fight for freedom overseas inspired them to take back some of their own freedoms once they got back home. By any means necessary.
Here we go!
The McMinn County War, better known as the Battle of Athens. But before we get into the video,
I don't know why, I always love his intro. I might just keep going just because, even though this is going to be like a sponsored segment, I might as well.
the mechs are finally here. Mech Arena is a 5v5 competitive shooter that is not like anything else.
On second thought. Sorry about that, guys. The sponsorship's long gone because of how old this video is.
On a political level by Republicans, and that was working out pretty well for the citizens. The local government operated as it should. It just handled the day-to-day bureaucracy and allowed... Click the link. In the decades following the Civil War, McMinn County in Tennessee was run on a political level by Republicans, and that was working out pretty well for the citizens. The local government operated as it should. It just handled the day-to-day bureaucracy and allowed the residents to attend to their farms without worry and without interference. The way a government should be. But something began to rear its head throughout the early 20th century. A Democrat bigwig named Edward Hull Crump was moves in the nearby Shelby County and gradually built a political machine from his mayoral seat in Memphis. By the 1930s, McMinn County had been hit by the Great Depression and a drought, which had greatly affected the community of farmers. But in 1936, everything changed. The Crump political machine rolled into to the small town of Athens and caused a bit of an upset. Crump appointed Paul Cantrell as the Democratic candidate for sheriff in the subsequent local election, and Cantrell based his campaign on the popularity of the Democrat Party's establishment and rode the wave of FDR's popularity all the way into office. The defeat of the incumbent Republican in the election became known as the vote grab of 1936 due to the widely held belief that the ballot boxes had been swapped. However, there was no proof, so this suspicion of fraud was completely unfounded.
Okay, that would definitely make sense, because if someone were to try that today, there'd be a lot more scrutiny compared to back then. But then again, and considering how corruption ran rampant through the 20s, and all the way up to several decades, means it kind of makes sense. And it's that something like this would have potentially happened.
At the time, as the Democrats' hold over McMinn County strengthened, shenanigans began to ensue, as there is no stronger combination than corruption and power.
Yeah.
The sheriff's office quickly started fee grabbing, which meant that officers were actually paid for each perp they arrested and locked up, despite the fact that Cantrell had taken out a full-page newspaper ad to promise that he wouldn't do that during his campaign. Politicians doing the opposite of what they promised.
Yeah, that... Ironically, that's actually typical of what to expect from politicians, especially today's politicians. I don't think the system will ever change, even if we do vote. Let's be real.
Saying so, for the deputies, this was basically free money. So it went exactly as you would expect. They would constantly harass tourists and locals alike, arresting everyone they could for drunkenness, whether they had been drinking or not. The deputies would eat...
Yeah, considering back then, they didn't have all the technology like the breathalyzers to... Or if you've been sober enough, or if you've been in like enough without alcohol. Also, all they had to do was just make a complete judgment call and bam, they declared you drunk.
Even go as far as to trawl through buses every night looking for people who looked really tired after a very hard day's work, so the police could falsely accuse them of being drunk so they could drag them to the police station to pay a $16.50 fine, which is $319.55 in today's money, adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
Around 115 people were arrested every weekend. Over the subsequent decade, it is estimated that $300,000 was paid out in these arrest fees, which is almost $6 million today. But that was only the beginning of the county's problems. To make things even worse, the US entered World War II in 1941, and 3,526 men, who made up 10% of the county's population, left to fight overseas. And since all of the local chads had gone off to fight a bigger fight, the men that stayed behind were undesirable, to say the least, and they actually aided the Democrats' increasing tyranny through their silence. In fact, the lack of decent men meant that law enforcement had no choice but to hire violent ex-cons. So basically the criminal justice system became a criminal justice system, that absolutely ravaged the town of Athens. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why didn't the people of Athens just vote the Democrats out if their policies were so bad? Well, Sheriff Cantrell thought that too. So he was ready whenever an election rolled around. He began a policy of collecting ballot boxes from all of the voting precincts after the elections and taking them to the county jail in Athens, where poll watchers would be kicked out so that the ballot boxes could be stuffed with ballots belonging to dead or non-existent people. However, this didn't stop investigations by the Department of Justice in 1940, 1942 and 1944. But, unfortunately, they were never resolved, allowing the Democrats to continue with his shady practices. In 1940, one of Cantrell's men, George Woods, was elected to the state legislature, and he immediately got to work in expanding the Democrats' power. In 1941, he introduced a bill that gerrymandered the absolute hell out of the county. The number of voting precincts and justices of the peace were each halved, with most of the remaining justices being Cantrell's men. Soon after, Cantrell himself joined the big boys in the state senate and installed his deputy, Pat Mansfield, as sheriff. And in 4 years, Mansfield managed to accumulate just over $100,000. The Republicans tried to fight back against this blatant corruption by using their influence in the McMinn County Court to purchase voting machines and stop the Democrats from, as they say nowadays, fortifying the election. It's a good move, right? Sure,
Yeah.
that would put a spanner in the works and enable the locals to vote the Democrats out, right? No. George Woods abolished the court and sold the machines. The Democrat machine had gotten so big that it abolished all of its opposition. From here, they really had free rein and started taking bribes in exchange for turning a blind eye to actual crimes, which led to the town being infested with prostitution, illegal booze, gambling, you name it, which tarnished the town's reputation and added some irony to the sign at the main highway into Athens, which referred to it as the friendly city. The situation got so bad that even if the locals could vote out the Democrats, they were too beaten down by the system to even try. The people of McMinn County, especially the women, were afraid of being pushed around by armed guards and decided to stay at home on polling day instead of putting up with the intimidation, especially since the Democrats used transparent boxes to make sure that the people were voting right. The townsfolk were now living in a small, crime-riddled authoritarian state where they had no say whatsoever in politics and they were threatened for even thinking of stepping out of line. Things were getting really desperate. But salvation was soon to come. The war...
Yeah. Worst part is, in some ways, I don't know, in a way it could be referred to now. I'm not gonna go into details because I do not want to get political, even though politics is heavy based in this video.
Had ended and the soldiers were coming home. The soldiers returned at the end of the war in 1945 to find their home in a complete state, thanks to the weasels that now lorded over the place. The economy had stagnated, local services such as schools had deteriorated, and the town had been overrun with all kinds of villainy. Athens was reduced to a shell of its former self. Yes, they were understandably pretty angry to see that their home had been turned into a corrupt shit pile, especially when the Democrats quickly turned on them. The soldiers were barely off the bus home before they were harassed by the deputies in the same way as the rest of the county. And the soldiers were...
Basically, the whole idea was, and this was according to the Fat Technician's video on this, pretty much what happened is once the soldiers started drinking at the bar, celebrating that they managed to come home alive from the war, or the sheriff saw a potential gold mine and falsely arresting the soldiers because they actually had money due to a severance package that they would get at the end of the war. And as a result, well, when you're talking about a greedy and corrupt system, you can imagine how that went.
Furious when the Democrats robbed them of their mustering out pay. Something clearly needed to be done, and the Republicans were no help whatsoever at this point. The soldiers quickly realised that if the Democrats were going to be ousted, they were going to have to do it themselves. The soldiers began to meet in secret, and on the 9th of May 1946, they announced a non-partisan ticket to rival the Democrat machine in the election on the 1st of August. Over 300 soldiers answered the call to clean up the community with the aid of Big Jim Buttram as campaign manager. Big Jim Buttram. The cellmate that no one wants. To raise over $8,000 from business owners. And they captured the hearts and minds of the county from their campaign headquarters in Athens, which wasn't exactly hard considering the people they were up against were hated by almost everyone. The soldiers fielded candidates for 5 offices, the most important being Knox Henry, who was facing off against Paul Cantrell himself because he had returned to run for his old job of sheriff. But obviously this town ain't big enough for the two of them, and the fight for the star-shaped badge was contentious to say the least. At the end of July, the soldiers petitioned the FBI to send in election monitors, and they were completely ignored. But there was one allegation of fraud that the authorities took very seriously. Cantrell had the audacity to accuse the soldiers of printing sample ballots to stuff the boxes with. Just the absolute fucking cheek. In response...
Okay, how stupid was that? I mean, really. Whether it... Well, time to see if that decision backfired. Then again, when it comes to criminals and corruption, they may be smart. Some of them might be smart, others stupid. But occasionally, the smart ones have an extreme moment of stupidity that ends up costing them everything.
The soldiers offered a $1,000 reward for proof of any kind of corruption on their part. And that reward was probably the only money that the Democrats didn't take from the town. 2 days before the election, the soldiers and the Democrats ran ads in the local paper. The soldiers' ad basically summarised their platform and encouraged the community to believe in them and clean up the county. The Democrats' ad was just a salty response that tried to smear the soldiers. On the 1st of August 1946, election day had arrived and the townsfolk went to the polls.
I imagine that worked well, considering how everyone bet the soldiers for those that were coming home after World War II.
At 9 a.m, the soldiers sent a message over the radio saying, "Go to your precincts, vote, and stay around all day to hear who wins." This is not old Germany. Hitler is not telling you how to vote. Don't be bothered by any scare campaign that Cantrell's henchmen may try. You will be safe at the polls, and your vote will be counted as cast. However, this statement proved to be a little too optimistic, and freeing Athens would prove to be a Herculean task. More than 200 deputies were drafted in to intimidate voters and keep the soldiers from doing their job, keeping the voting precincts under armed guard. Trouble kicked off almost immediately after the polls opened. At 9:30 a.m, a soldier representative was arrested for protesting irregularities at the 1st Precinct's courthouse, despite being legally entitled to be there. To make matters even worse, the deputies refused to let Jim Buttram bail the guy out of the jail. Sadly, the bad news coming to the campaign HQ only got worse, as Jim Buttram took in all of the reports of shenanigans at the polls. He then had to break the news that 2 telegrams that he had sent to the Governor and Attorney General had been ignored. The soldiers,
of course,
were on their own. However, this came as no surprise to a Marine Corps veteran named Bill White, who was undeterred and urged his fellow soldiers to take up arms and mobilise. But Buttram and their political advisor Otto Kennedy shot this idea down. But as consolation for the dire situation, Kennedy did offer the soldiers his garage and tyre shop as a meeting place for after the election. At around 3 p.m, an elderly African-American man named Tom Gillespie arrived at the local waterworks with his poll tax receipt to cast his vote. But despite there being no legal reason whatsoever for Tom to not vote, a deputy named Windy Wise wasn't having it. Wise
wouldn't surprise me if it was both a mixture of corruption and racism, considering this is the American South pre-Martin Luther King Jr.
began harassing Tom on site with copious use of the gamer word. However, Tom stood his ground and insisted on exercising his rights. So Wise started beating Tom with brass knuckles. But age had not slowed old Tom down, and he was determined to enact his right to vote. So he got up, walked right into the polling place, and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed in a show of defiance. Unfortunately, this bravery only infuriated Wise even further. So Wise then pulled out his gun and shot Tom in the back, and then arrested Tom and took him to jail. Luckily, Tom survived. Now, if things were tense before, the sound of a gunshot at a polling place almost blew the powder keg. The nearby crowd was furious at what they just saw, but ultimately they were powerless against the gun-toting deputies. However, the crowd did manage to help someone out. 2 soldier poll watchers named Ed Vestal and Charles Scott were being held captive at the waterworks just after Tom was shot. Buttram risked his life to try and bargain for the soldiers' release, which resulted in one of Mansfield's deputies pointing a gun right in his face for trying to tell them how to run their election. Realising that no one was going to give up on them and that further attempts to free them would probably get someone killed, Vestal and Scott went, "Screw this," and freed themselves. Scott got up and launched himself from a desk, into a glass door, and he bounced right off of it.
Damn!
Before he could get the crap beaten out of him by angry deputies that were suddenly rushing towards him, he yeeted himself at the door again and went straight through it. Vestal quickly followed suit, and the two of them then got up and hauled arse into the relative safety of the crowd with their hands up in the air to make sure that they wouldn't get shot. But the two men were covered in cuts from all of the shattered glass. Soon after, a poll watcher named Bob Harrell ran out of patience and confronted one of the deputies after spending the entire day watching this deputy take ballots from people without poll tax receipts, giving out bribes, and even letting small children vote. The deputy didn't hesitate to whack Bob over the head with a club, hit him in the face a few times when he hit the ground, and beat the ever-loving shit out of him. All Bob's partner, Les Dooley, could do was watch before he himself was held at gunpoint and the two men were sent to jail. The bastards even stole Bob's wallet. After this confrontation, the deputies closed the polling place and blocked the entrance to the cafe where the voting took place. At 4 p.m, the polls finally closed, but the main event was only just beginning.
Hey!
Field had sent 2 deputies to the soldiers' headquarters to recapture Scott and Vestal. Great plan. Send in just 2 guys to a building full of God knows how many pissed-offs.
Okay, also, according to that technician's video, the estimation was at least 100 pissed-off veterans at that body shop. So yeah, 2 guys, 2 corrupt deputies versus 100 pissed-off military vets that came back from World War II. Not so very good odds. Definitely a smart plan.
Soldiers who are just back from World War II that you have spent the entire day beating up and harassing. What a great plan. It went exactly as you would expect. The deputies, thinking that they were hard as nails, pointed their guns at the soldiers and demanded that they hand over Scott and Vestal. The soldiers immediately disarmed the 2 deputies and beat the absolute shit out of them.
Rightfully so!
The soldiers then tied both of them up inside the building. The soldiers now had 2 hostages. Luckily for these deputies, backup was being sent to bust them out and arrest Scott and Vestal. 2 more deputies were sent to the soldiers' headquarters. And the exact same thing happened again.
Oh man, these guys never learned, did they? Then again, it makes sense. Vince, don't go for the same tactics, switch tactics.
The soldiers now had 4 hostages. The deputies quickly realised that they would have to think bigger if they wanted their men back. So this time they sent 3 men to the soldiers' headquarters. 7 hostages. What you would do with the hostages?
Yeah, don't need to explain that.
Wanted blood, which greatly disturbed Otto Kennedy, so he knocked out of there and left. Fortunately, most of the soldiers knew better than to murder their enemies, so they simply took them 10 miles out into the woods, roughed them up a good bit, and then tied them to trees so that they could be left out of the way. At 6 p.m, despite the excitement of this incident, the few soldiers that hadn't gone home met at Otto Kennedy's garage. The mood was sour, to say the least. Everyone's spirits had been crushed under the weight of the events of the election. The Democrats' influence was too strong, and the ballot boxes were taken to the town jail, where Cantrell, Mansfield and around 50 deputies holed up with 4 soldier hostages for the standard procedure of stuffing the boxes away from prying eyes. The election had been stolen again. All of the soldiers' hard work had been for nothing. They tried to reform the system from within, but the democracy that they fought so hard for across the ocean had failed. Everyone's faith in the system had been crushed. All hope had been lost. Or had it? As we all know, a man will go to extraordinary lengths to take what is his when pushed hard enough. And the soldiers were all extraordinary men. There was one man who refused to back down without a fight. Literally. Bill White, the Marine, saw another way. You see, he remembered that there was one little gift that the Founding Fathers left the American people for situations just like this. The Second Amendment.
Oh, baby!
The spirit of the room full of hardened veterans before him had to be brought forth with a rallying cry. So, in a big Hollywood moment, he stepped up and spoke. Now this is quite a long speech, but I'm keeping it in anyway, because it's glorious.
Speaking of Hollywood, why don't they turn this into a Hollywood movie? Seriously. For as many times as I've seen content creators react to this story, it should be something that should be in... It'd be a Hollywood movie by now. Excuse me. But alas, I don't think we're ever gonna get it.
Well, here you are. After 3 or 4 years of fighting for your country, you survived it all. You came back. And what did you come back to? A free country? You came back to Athens, Tennessee, in McMinn County, that's run by a bunch of outlaws. What for? One purpose: to scare you so bad that you won't dare stand up for the rights you've been bleeding and dying for. Some of your mothers and some of your sisters are afraid to walk down the streets to the polling places. Lots of men too, because they know what happens. A car drives by in the night and shoots out your windows. If that doesn't scare you enough, they'll set fire to your house or your barn. They'll beat up members of your family and put them in jail for no reason. Is that the kind of freedom you were supposed to be fighting for? Do you know what your rights are supposed to be? How many rights have you got left? None. Not even the right to vote in a free election. When you lose that, you've lost everything. And you are damned well going to lose it unless you fight. And fight the only way they understand. Fire with fire. We've got to make this an honest election because we promised the people that if they voted, it would be an honest election. And it's going to be.
Amen.
But only if we see that it is. We are going to have to run these organised criminals out of town. And we can do it if we stick together. Are you afraid of them? Why, I could take a banana stalk and run every one of those pot-belly draft dodgers across Depot Hill. Get the hell out of here and get something to shoot with. And come back as fast as you can. The regalvanised, which later became known as the Fighting Bunch, raided the National Guard armoury and stole 60 Enfield rifles, 2 Tommy guns, and ammo for each man to have 2 bandoliers each. It was showtime. The bunch converged on the jail at 7:30, but they weren't just going to form an orderly queue behind the red velvet rope and loiter around the town hall for a little while and maybe steal a podium until they got bored. Oh, no. These guys meant business, and there was a hell of a lot more at stake than some left his shoes. The soldiers took up positions on the road across from the jail, but left the back door unguarded to give any wounded deputies a safe way out. They also put men on the second floor of a bank across the road from the jail to give themselves the ultimate advantage. One
Sniper.
of the soldiers called out to the deputies holed up in the jail. Bring those boxes out and there won't be any trouble. It was nice of the soldiers to give the deputies a chance to give up. It's just a shame that they were too stubborn and replied that you're going to have to come and get them. If you say so.
Oh, man, you think because he's got, man, if there's one thing I know, never mess with people that have nothing to lose. Because in the end, well, it's gonna go bad for you. I don't need to explain more than that.
Attempt to liberate the town had failed. So the stage was set. At 9 p.m, both sides stood at opposite ends of the street, ready for the inevitable to play out. And as the saying goes, the tree of liberty must be replenished from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
And tyrants.
And it was time to do a little gardening. Of this pointless arguing back and forth, and pulled back the bolt on his rifle. Hearing the click, the deputies hauled arse into the jail just before the first shots were fired. The first volley shattered the jail's windows, and the civilians in the streets began to panic and run for cover. The first injury of the night occurred when a 50-year-old woman fell and hit her head on the pavement. So, you know, not too bad. But many other injuries on both sides soon followed, with deputies that didn't make it into the jail in time getting shot and crawling for shelter under cars or inside the jail itself. Others simply walked it off and took themselves to hospital with chests full of buckshot.
Just a flesh wound.
The street blazed with muzzle flashes as an orchestra of shotgun blasts, ricochets and rifle cracks echoed across the town. You could even hear the gunshots in the background of the local radio broadcast. Bill shot out 2 lights near the jail to reduce the deputies' view of what they were aiming at. And also, an important thing to note, the deputies only had their standard issue pistols and a single Tommy gun. 1776 had commenced again, and America's rebellious spirit had reawoken in Athens. The locals were hyped. They were absolutely hyped. After the panic of the shootout had died down, the townsfolk found places where they could safely watch the gunfight while cheering on the soldiers and taunting the deputies. Boy, I do love a good boogaloo. In fact, everyone was having such a great time that some of the spectators and the soldiers' wives were serving the soldiers refreshments while they were hunkered down behind overturned cars, as well as giving them words of encouragement as they handed them a nice cup of tea. Although the attacks were very uncoordinated, as the red brick jail was impenetrable to the small arms fire. But thanks to their position in the bank, it was easy enough for the soldiers to just light up the jail whenever anyone from the other side took a pot shot at them. At around midnight, a soldier named Cecil Smith ran out to a deputy who had spent 3 hours bleeding in front of the jail with a broken leg after having been shot while trying to make a break for it at the start of the battle. Cecil then carried out a transfusion using his own blood, which saved the deputy's life. Despite the beef that the two men had, Cecil didn't want anyone in his community to die. After all, it would make neighbourly barbecues pretty awkward. Eventually, the soldiers realised that the siege was becoming drawn out, and rumours of impending reinforcements had shaken their confidence, as they were essentially sitting branch Davidians if the National Guard, state troopers, or even Polk County Sheriff showed up. It also didn't help that Mansfield kept threatening to kill the soldiers they had taken hostage if the soldiers didn't end the siege. Luckily, no soldiers in the jail were actually hurt. Well, they weren't hurt any more than they had already been at the time of their arrest.
We get the idea.
The soldiers had to wrap this up quickly or spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But while time was of the essence, the situation wasn't as bad as the soldiers thought. Cantrell did call the National Guard, but they refused to provide them with any backup. After all, this was all Cantrell's fault. He made his bed, so the National Guard told him that he could fucking lie in it. While this George Woods had also tried to phone Polk County Sheriff, but got a hold of his son instead, who responded to the call for help with, "Do you think I'm crazy?" and hung up. To make matters even worse for the deputies, they were seriously low on ammunition by 1 a.m. and the soldiers had also cut the telephone lines to the jail. As the battle raged into the night, the soldiers tried tossing Molotov cocktails at the jail, which had no real effect on the deputies' defences because car fuel can't melt red brick.
Yeah.
Many of their weapons running out of ammo, the soldiers needed something a bit more substantial. They needed a bit more bang for their buck. So the soldiers went to the county barn and got some dynamite. However, before they could really start lighting up the jail, an ambulance pulled up at the front. The soldiers immediately ceased fire to allow what they thought was a medical evacuation. But instead of getting the wounded out of the jail, the ambulance was there so that Cantrell and Mansfield could escape. So not only were Cantrell and Mansfield abandoning their men in the middle of a fight that they started, but they were also doing it in a vehicle that the soldiers could not fire upon without maybe committing some kind of war crime. The dynamite arrived at around 2:30 and the
cowards, of course. I don't think they were ever heard from again, but I'm not really sure.
Soldiers were quick to offer an ultimatum, saying, and I quote, "Turn the soldiers loose in 15 minutes or we dynamite the jail." The deputies began to realise that they were screwed, and an ominous quiet fell over the area. One woman screamed, "Don't do it, I've got a boy in that jail." But the crowd went wild. They were absolutely loving it. They were cheering the soldiers on, telling them to blow up the jail. At 2:48 a.m, a stick of dynamite was thrown under a police cruiser, which flipped it over. 3 more bundles were thrown in quick succession, 2 of which destroyed the jail's porch. And, for good measure, the soldiers also used the dynamite to blow up Mansfield's car. As expected, the explosions shook the deputies as hard as the city's windows and trees, and they finally surrendered at 3 a.m. After 6 hours of fighting, the ballot boxes were secured. Athens was about to have its first legitimate vote count in over a decade. But before the count could begin, the fighting continued. Years of frustration suddenly boiled over, and the civilians quickly became a lynch mob that started to unleash their fury on the surrendered deputies.
They probably would have got the Mansfield guy and his buddy too.
Of the deputies received savage beatings, but things quickly started to escalate. One deputy had his throat slit and another was shot in the jaw. Things were getting a little out of hand. The mob also targeted police cars and the private cars of the deputies, which were identified by the license plates being from out of state. But luckily the soldiers quickly restored order before anyone got killed, and they managed to maintain the moral high ground by respecting the defeated deputies' right to due process. And the deputies were released the following morning. With the ballot boxes in safe hands, the votes were finally counted. After all that struggle, all that heartache, all of the literal blood, sweat and tears that went into fighting tooth and nail to ensure that the election wouldn't be rigged, a statement was read on the radio. The GIs, the soldiers, election officials, went to the polls unarmed to have a fair election, as Pat Mansfield promised. They were met with blackjacks and pistols. Several GI officials were beaten and the ballot boxes were moved to the jail. The GI supporters went to the jail to get these ballot boxes and were met by gunfire. The GI candidates had promised that the votes would be counted as cast. They had no choice but to meet fire with fire. In the precincts where the GI candidates were allowed watchers, they led by 3-1 majorities. The GIs are elected and will serve as your county officials. They've done it. And not only had they won the first honest election in Athens for over a decade, but it was an absolute landslide. McMinn County had finally been freed from the tyranny of the Democrat machine in the only successful armed rebellion since the American Revolution. But they weren't out of the woods just yet. Cantrell and Mansfield were still out there. Over 1,000 soldiers and civilians prepared for a retaliatory invasion by patrolling the streets for the next 3 nights and setting up machine guns at all of the entry points to the town. But luckily the Democrats didn't come back, and no one suffered any legal repercussions from the battle, except for Wendy Wise, who was sentenced to 3 years in jail for shooting Tom Gillespie in the back. And you will be very happy to hear that after the battle had ended, Wendy Wise immediately had the absolute shit kicked out of all of the townsfolk. But at least he saw the error of his ways, and he was quoted as saying, "No hard feelings, I don't blame the boys for wanting to get a few licks in at me. I had it coming." Good attitude. You are still an absolute scumbag though. Once Pat Mansfield had resigned on the 4th of August and the election was certified by George Woods the following morning, Knox Henry served as sheriff for 2 terms until he passed away in 1952, with Otto Kennedy as his successor. The soldiers immediately got to work on cleaning up the town. The deputies from the previous administration that resigned were replaced. The gambling houses and their ilk were run out of town, and public officials were given a $5,000 salary cap. One of Henry's other first actions as sheriff was deputising Bill, the man who gave that wonderful speech, and he was in charge of keeping the soldiers in check. Bill went on to have an illustrious career of kicking arse and taking names. When trying to repossess a doctor's car, Bill was actually shot at, and he also apprehended a serial burglar and also a murderer that had escaped from prison. One man that Bill had pulled over for drunk driving didn't want to be taken alive, but the hammer of his gun got caught in his trousers, so Bill arrested him instead of obliging him. Oh, and Bill also blew up a giant 70-gallon still with 8 sticks of dynamite, because why not? What about Cantrell and Mansfield? Where did they end up after their escape? Did the people of Athens ever get them back for the absolute hell they put them through for that 10 years. Well, Cantrell laid low for a while in Hamilton County before settling down in Etowah, another city in McMinn County, where he ran the town bank with his brothers, because of course the slimy bastard that swindled his community would become a banker. Mansfield actually returned to Athens, but surprisingly he managed to live the rest of his life in peace. He had a nice chat with Otto Kennedy to bury the hatchet, and there was no bad blood between them. Mansfield is quoted as saying, "I'm through with politics for good. It'll sure mess you up sometimes. I'm going back to railroading." Sadly, old party affiliations returned as time went on, and the soldier coalition fell apart, giving rise to the same kinds of cliques that they fought so hard to prevent. However, the soldier struggle wasn't in vain. The Battle of Athens inspired similar campaigns in other counties across Tennessee, although they were much less violent because the powers that be knew that the soldiers were not to be messed with, which led to the collapse of the E.H. Crump political machine and snowballed into the decline of other political machines all over the South. Despite having bravely put their lives on the line to fight corruption, the soldiers were lambasted in the press, which shouldn't be a surprise. The establishment is being disrupted. The New York Times was particularly scathing, basically calling the soldiers a bunch of thugs that should have used the system to reform their community peacefully.
The New York Times? Shocking. Don't those idiots know that they tried that? I bet if they had a halfway decent journalist that was working there, actually interview some of those guys, they would get the whole story straight.
Which they tried to do that, but the system was rigged to prevent them from doing that. They wouldn't have had to boogaloo if the system actually worked in the first place. Fortunately, with the power of hindsight and the full context of the situation becoming widespread, public opinion on the battle is much more positive now. The common term used to refer to this incident is based. Also, the Tennessee Historical Commission immortalised the Battle of Athens with a marker detailing the soldiers' deeds at the site of the battle. The soldiers are remembered in Athens as pillars of the community that were involved in not only politics, but their churches and various civic clubs. One local judge fondly said, and I quote, "They led positive and productive lives, and they left a legacy that their families can and should be very proud of. In short, they proved themselves to be the very kind of good citizens that deserve a fair and honest government to represent them," which is all they had ever asked for in the first place. Ultimately, the soldiers that fought in the Battle of Athens are not only inspirational figures for the way they exemplified the expression, "Give me liberty or give me death," also conduct leading up to, during and after the battle. They truly didn't want it to come to blows, and they went out of their way to make sure that no one died. All they wanted was the best for their community, and the lengths they were willing to go to protect the freedom of both their neighbours and the world can't be commended enough. If only modern politicians could follow their example.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service.
I agree. Well, guys. That was a good one. Although I doubt I could put this as a... I doubt I could label this as educational, because even though it's historical, the truth is, I doubt YouTube would see it that way, but... Still, I'm actually glad that I reacted to this. And tomorrow, I'll have something from the Fat Technician, the American, in my opinion, is like the American version of Count Dankula. So, I'll tune in tomorrow for that. Anyways, that's it for me. If you liked today's video, please leave a like, drop a comment down below. Also, please feel free to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to get notified on when I post new videos or when I go live. You can also find me on social media. I'll leave all my links on the original video in the description below. And also, hopefully this week I'll be able to basically set it up so I can set up a separate streaming channel for YouTube. Until next time, see ya.